Okay, I think we're live here. So welcome everyone to the closing panel of the People in Technology Forum. Our topic today and our panel topic is civic computing, which is basically the role that information technology can play in connecting citizens to their governments and also in building stronger and more effective communities. We've got a wonderful set of panelists here today. One of the things that really strikes me about this panel is their diversity along a number of dimensions, everything from civic computing in the domestic space to the international space, as well as at a range of scales from local neighborhood communities to cities to nations. So it should be a great panel for us. I'm really pleased to quickly introduce our panelists. Kristen Wilson is the director of the Innovation Delivery Team for the City of Atlanta. DiSalvo is a professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication here at Georgia Tech. David Kobia is the co-founder and director of technology development for Ushahidi. And Mike Best is a professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs and in the School of Interactive Computing here at Georgia Tech. So I'm going to kick things off by asking the panelists just to very quickly give us like a 1 or 2 minute introduction to kind of yourselves and your background and your perspective, and then we'll launch into some questions. So, Kristin, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Keith. My name is Kristen Canavan Wilson. I lead up an innovation delivery team for Mayor Kasim Reed here in the city of Atlanta. I spent most of my career to date in the corporate world. I just joined the city a little less than a year ago to head up what is essentially a special projects team. There are 2 projects we've started working on within the administration. One is reducing street homelessness, and I'm happy to say we've had a chance already to work with some members of Georgia Tech on some opportunities to bring technology to that problem. And secondly, we're working also on improving customer service in the city of Atlanta, and in particular looking at 311, which is a non-emergency number for accessing city services. It's going to generate a tremendous amount of data for the city, which will hopefully also give us some great opportunities to collaborate and work together.
That's great. Carl?
Yeah, I'm Carl DiSalvo. I'm in the digital media program in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication. And my work has to do with participatory models of design and innovation. So how do we bring people to the design process, particularly with information and communication technologies, that aren't usually part of the design process? And so in the past, I've worked around issues of environmental monitoring, and more recently in looking at technology support for small-scale agriculture. And to sort of give a flavor of the kinds of things that I'm interested in and up to, one of the projects that I'm most excited about now is trying to put together a public design lab with some of my colleagues that would be a place that would be situated in the city, offsite of campus, that would bring together community members and technologists and designers to innovate technologies together in situ and then deploy them out into their neighborhoods.
David?
Thanks for the introduction. My name is David Kobia. I'm the Director of Technology at Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a nonprofit technology company that specializes in building free and open source software tools for information collection, visualization, interactive mapping, that sort of thing. Basically, these are tools that help that help to democratize information and really allowing people to tell their own versions of their story, which in this case happens to be with maps. It turned out that maps are a really great way to tell a story. Ushahidi itself means witness. It was born out of post-election violence in Kenya almost 5 years ago. We're actually coming up on another election this March. And looking forward to this discussion.
Great, thanks. Mike?
Thank you very much, Keith. And my name's Mike Best, as Keith mentioned, and I examine the role of information and communication technologies in social, economic, and political development, primarily in low-income countries. I've had projects across the globe in Africa, India, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, but right now mostly I'm working in West Africa. The kind of projects that my lab focuses on ranges from social science research and policy interventions to computer engineering and development of innovative systems. Right now we have projects that are looking at the role of information and communication technologies in peace building and post-conflict reconciliation, in civic and political engagement, and in wireless and branchless banking, so quite a range of projects. And over the last few years, we've also engaged in systems for health informatics and for agriculture information systems.
Great, thank you all. So, not 100% certain, but I thought for many of the folks who are here, the notion of civic computing or the idea of using information technologies for civic purposes, such as to connect with the government or to build stronger communities, might be a topic that some of us haven't really thought too much about. So I wanted to kind of kick the discussion off with a very broad question, just to sort of orient the audience to what we're talking about here. So I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you see as some of the opportunities for civic computing systems to kind of advance the missions of governments, of non-governmental organizations, and nonprofits, both here and abroad? So who wants to take this one first?
I'm happy to, if
Yeah,
you'd like.
absolutely.
From maybe a more local perspective, certainly there has been already a fair amount of civic computing engagement from a point app or from a very point social media perspective in a lot of different cities. So you hear about things like the apps for See, Click, Fix, or for reporting a pothole to a city. You sometimes hear about specific social media champions like Mayor Cory Booker out of New Jersey. But one of the things that I think really we just maybe started to scratch at is how is it that civic computing can really lead to the next generation of engagement and decision-making within a city. So how is it that we can go and leverage the power of technology to move from what is essentially an offline world of community engagement today? Here in Atlanta, we have these neighborhood planning unit meetings. Well, I looked at some of the data. The most people we've ever had attend one of those was about 80 people back when schools were being redistricted last January. That was 80 people in a neighborhood that represented tens of thousands of residents in Atlanta. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about statistic sampling sizes, but I think that we probably failed pretty dramatically in these cases. And so it seems to me that technology and the ability to really kind of broaden the civic engagement and bringing more citizen engagement into the actual decision-making processes that occur within the city are going to be really the next realm for us to move forward on. And no one's cracked that nut yet.
Others?
No, I was just going to say, I think we like to call it, in this day and age, that everyone has a kind of a digital front seat to events happening not just in their community, but around the world, right? So on one hand, while people are incentivized to participate during a disaster, that then makes it easier for people to participate, with simple things like reporting crime, or with Kristin mentioned. I think it has to be seen more of as a conversation and not a one-way thing coming from the top down. It's more from the bottom up. Now I think things have changed in that sense. I think everyone is having a conversation, and I think it's up to policymakers to tap into this thing that is already going on. They don't have a choice to in 2012. So.
Building on that, I think one of the things that we see is new forms of citizenship that are very exciting. So it's no longer just about showing up to vote, although that is still important. But what are the ways in which neighborhoods are making videos that show what they think is special or what's an issue, or what are the ways that people are using this variety of media to voice their concerns and their desires and their aspirations for civic life that really should augment the kinds of civic institutions we already have. So I think it's this bottom-up expansion of what it means to be an active citizen that's really exciting.
I think my fellow panelists have done a great job of listing many of the opportunities, engagements, new forms of engagements, accountability, transparency, service indicators, and service delivery. As, wearing the hat of an academic for a second, I think the flip side to the opportunity issue is how do we then go to measure the impacts? Because right now I would say we're in a period of time when we know more about opportunities than we understand about actualities. And so what I think we want to do as it relates to opportunities is begin to build a rigorous and robust feedback loop and lessons learned loop to understand how we go from opportunity to actually a robust understanding of impact and meaning, and also how we might innovate and invent new forms of social media and technologies that kind of leverage the broader scope of opportunities we've already identified.
Well, and I agree, and new ways of tracking that. I mean, that's the problem. If you look at the way that citizenship is tracked now, you can get a survey, and this is often the way it's deployed, and it asks you questions like, how many times did you go to church, or how many times did you go to this community meeting? But it doesn't ask you, how many times did you blog about this concern of yours, or how many people have seen your YouTube video in which you're addressing school redistricting. So part of what I would agree we have to do as academics is think about what are the ways in which we can codify this so that other people can point to and say, that's what's happening, and that's the way in which it's happening. Because that doesn't exist.
So in the same vein of challenges, I want to build on something that Kristen said, and I know that this is something we've talked about before, which is, there's this neighborhood planning process in Atlanta where there are meetings which are sort of rarely attended, I guess, by a representative section of the citizenry there, and there's also this challenge that often it's the loudest voice in the room that sort of gets all of the airtime at these things, the same people that show up over and over and over again to these planning meetings with their particular opinions. And of course, this is something that would never happen in social media, where loud voices sort of dominate the discussion. But how do we balance that? It seems like in a lot of the forms of social media that we see these days, and especially coming off the U.S. election cycle, I'm sure all of us have experience with this. You get very strong opinions on social media system. How do we take these online forms of conversation and communication and adapt or tweak them so that we might be able to have different styles of discourse, that it might be more amenable for the ways that people need to provide input to government?
Is that for me or anyone?
For anyone,
okay.
yeah. All
I'm
these are
happy
for
to
everyone.
jump off first. I think the closest model I've seen so far of an approach that seems like it's much more built on a decision-making process is participatory budgeting. If you look at the way participatory budgeting has happened in different cities across the U.S., it really has both involved online and offline conversations, and it has directed the online conversations in a very kind of moderated and mediated way to attempt to get as broad and expansive a view. So the technology was being particularly used for that perspective, but then it still was married with offline community meetings to then take that input and work through decision-making, ideation sessions and things like that that lent themselves more towards people being in a room around something physical and having those conversations. And it seems that at the end of the day, looking at the ways cities make decisions and really thinking about processes versus events, and then working through those together. I'm not going to say it's going to take away. There's always going to be individuals with great passion, and that's the beauty of democracy, is figuring out the right way to get all of those voices into the system.
Right. Other thoughts and comments on that?
I mean, I would agree. And part of this is about architecting our both virtual or social media spaces and, as you're mentioning, our physical spaces to support good interactions or the best forms of interaction around civic engagement. And we know some of the things that might mean. It might mean, for instance, that ideas are more important than identity. It might mean that pseudonymity or anonymity is not preferred to voicing with your identity in place, a kind of tension between the first point. It might mean that single voices can't dominate and that there has to be some sort of broader conversation. It might mean that majoritarianism is not preferred, for instance. So there's all sorts of ways in which one might architect a virtual environment, if we think for a second just on that case, to support the specific best forms of civic dialogue and engagement for the specific problems that one is trying to work on. There are, and actually, Keith, you mentioned this in our email thread prior to the panel, There are ideas about this. There are a few examples of this in terms of built physical or virtual environments, but by and large, they're actually the kind of things we're talking about are generalized spaces that are being then used or co-opted into the civic engagement space, where we're not even sure whether there is some impedance mismatch between the architectures of the environment and the problems at hand.
Right, gotcha. So given the expertise of our panelists, I wanted to focus a little bit on the domestic versus international kind of perspective. So civic technologies, computing technologies are being used for civic ends in many places in the world. Do you see differences or similarities in the way that those technologies are being appropriated or used in the US versus, say, Kenya or other places in the world? Are there things that we here in the US should be paying attention to where other countries might be ahead of us, for example?
Well, for starters, with regard to technology, I think especially people in the US assume, number one, everyone speaks English, right? Which is always a problem. And that everyone has a smartphone. Now, and just to use some examples, like when we were engaged in Haiti, for instance, it's building these technologies and then realizing that we really can't do anything with it because we're getting all the text messages in Creole, right? So no one that we're working with speaks Creole, right? So number one is realizing that everyone out there, people are speaking different languages, that sort of thing. Along with that is the fact that maybe in Haiti people are using text messaging. In Japan, everyone has a smartphone. So with crisis and disaster response in Japan, everyone is really a lot more engaged in the conversation than in Haiti, where it's probably a one-way kind of thing, where someone sends a message out into space and hopes they get a response. So it's definitely different in that sense. I think.
I guess I kind of shamelessly want to have it both ways. I want to say that there are rich differences and that there's no difference. So on the one hand, I think Carl works in very interesting ways in areas very close to Georgia Tech. And there's programs now in the West End or in West Atlanta that are trying to tie technologies and other activities at Georgia Tech. And when I hear and learn from you all about that kind of work, I think of the deep commonality between what I do, say, in Nigeria and what Carl and others are doing in Atlanta. And that there is a huge amount of commonality that we can learn from. There's things that we can learn by comparing the similarities between these environments in terms of the role of computing and communication technologies and the legitimate development objectives that these communities hold. And I should say that that's actually not the general viewpoint in many ways, because the two communities of folks who focus on humanitarian technologies in, say, underserved or urban environments in the US and those that focus on the international aspects of that same problem space do not generally talk together. And I think we want to at least interrogate that dialectic, if not destroy it. However, as I say, I kind of want to have it both ways, because everything David said I completely concur with. So, for instance, I'm doing a lot on civic engagement and computing and communications right now in Nigeria. So that's a country of 150 million people. It's massive. 50 million, maybe a third of the country, is online in one way or another. They are not with smartphones. They have feature phones. So the feature phone might get some of them on Facebook. So about 4 million people in the country might be on Facebook, and many of that is via feature phones, if not, they're sort of not super smart, but kind of smart phones. Those numbers are not what you would find here in Atlanta, even in urban areas, where there's going to be a considerably higher penetration of mobile telephony, feature phones, Facebook, social media. However, those numbers are stunning. And if you looked at Nigeria 3 years ago, let alone 5 years ago, you would have seen a completely different landscape in terms of internet and feature phone penetration. So it's both very different and very similar.
I think that there are, I would agree, and there's some interesting logistical differences. So my colleague Chris Ledantic is really leading the way in developing relationships with folks in the West Side. And he and I were chatting about the difficulties of getting students over to the West Side. And then I happened to be sitting at dinner with Mike, and I was like, yeah, it's really difficult for us to get students to the West Side. And he's like, yeah, let me tell you what it's like to get students to Ghana. And so, I mean, there are logistic differences that we need to understand. But then it was also pointed out, at least there are times when students may be more willing to go further than to go closer, which is interesting. I would also say, with the comment about the smartphones, I still find that here. This weekend I was at a hackathon that was done in town, and it was a great event where they brought together developers to try to develop mobile solutions for 5 nonprofits. And it was the charge of the activity to do this around the idea of smartphones. But as I sat there, I just thought, like, it's not clear to me that is at all the right solution. Like, lots of code got written, lots of things got made. I'm not convinced that any of the right things got made. And I think that's the real challenge. And I think it's true for both the professional developer community, and it's also true for the academic community, which is really has this fetishistic relationship with the new and, yeah. So.
That's great. So I want to come back and touch on something that I think Mike may have hinted at just a little bit, and specifically focusing on social media here. One of the things that it seems is really powerful about social media is that so many of the conversations over social media effectively play out in the open, right? They're there for everyone to hear. And of course, conversations that play out in the open can be monitored. In some parts of the world, there may be potential for repercussion there. On the other side of the coin, though, these conversations that play out in the open can be very, very useful for input into government, to get a sense of the mood of the citizenry, to find out what's going on and which way the winds are blowing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tensions between these two. And it touches on a lot of issues also, like identity. Right? So Google+, there was this big flap around Google+, that they wanted real verifiable names in their social media system, which may be really good for some things if you want to do, sort of accurate polling and you want to make sure that people are not astroturfing the site, but may play against other uses where people would prefer anonymity. So I'm wondering if the panelists can just talk a little bit about that tension. Do they think it's possible for a single social media system to maybe fulfill both of these roles? Are we going to need something completely new or different for both roles?
I don't know. I think there's so many challenges. On one hand, you have a considerable amount of naivety with regard to social media, and we see that in places like China, right? Sudan or even the Arab Spring, for that matter, is naivety with activists, excited about social media, being able to share and putting this stuff out there. But then realizing that, as you said, there's a lot of monitoring going on. So people start to realize that social media is great on one hand, but then it fights against the fact that pseudonymity and anonymity are then becoming very expensive, right? In between, those are casualties of social media. Then on the other hand, you have people like here in the US oversharing, right? So... And I think, again, one of my favorite quotes by Peter Benenson is, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. The problem is that everyone now has a candle and about to burn the house down with all, expressing themselves, right? So there's that issue. There's oversharing on this end, and then diametrically opposed to it is the fact that in other places, people now are realizing that we had a little naivety we could share before, but there are repercussions. So people will come and pick us up if we share. So the middle ground for both of those is really hard to find, I think.
Yeah, I would say the Pew Research Center just came out with statistics on this last presidential campaign, and almost 70% of those who have access to social media did something around the election in terms of tweeting or Facebook posting. I look at this as a fairly digital room. I can't imagine any of us were immune on any social, sites that we have to not see more than we wanted to, probably, political commentary. And one of the things I was thinking about was, how much did that actually change anyone's opinions? I mean, for most of what I saw, it was either people were finding things they believed in and prescribing it out there, and then maybe inciting debate around entrenched positions already. So I think the big issue is it feels like the social media channels we have today, as they're kind of constructed today, do not set up room for real dialogue. They do set up a lot of room for people to state positions and entrench themselves in those positions. And I think until we figure out how we map over to some future world in which there is more I hate to go back to the word architecture, but architecture around dialogue, I think we're going to, I hope in some ways, that we start losing energy around this type of activity.
Right. Carl, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I know you've sort of thought about these issues. How do you have that vigorous debate without this, this sort of just digging into entrenched positions and turning off positions that you disagree with?
I think it's really tricky because I will go out there and say I'm not someone who at all believes in consensus, right? I mean, in my opinion, the sign of a democracy is the ability to disagree, and to disagree in very sort of productive but forceful ways. And so, on the one hand, I think we need to have these systems that allow us to actually play out those disagreements in strong terms. And you still see that. You go to an NPU meeting and people will stand up and yell at each other about things that are important to them in their neighborhood. And I think that we need to think about how do we design systems that allow us to have those. One answer I would give is there's no way, that's not going to happen in the kind of social media systems that we're seeing today, because those social media systems are really designed for one reason, and that's to capitalize on all of our creative energies, right? I mean, this is the great point. We're not the clients of Facebook, right? That's whoever buys Facebook's data. So it doesn't support the agendas of those social media systems to be places for open political discourse. Like, at the end of the day, that's not their business. And one of the things to imagine and try to build are parallel networks that actually are set up for social discourse. It's sort of like expecting to go into a mall and have that be the equivalent of the forum. Like, no, the mall is the mall. You need a different sort of place to have a parliament that's not the mall. Right now, social media is the mall, and the kind of politics that are going to play out there are the same kind of schlocky politics that you'd buy at the mall. And I think it's worth pointing that out. And I think you can even push that further and to say, when you really look at what's going on, I think we have to be very wary of using social media systems for real political expression. So I would point out that lots of people got really excited about Twitter and Facebook and Egypt and places like that. When activists used Twitter and Facebook to support protests in the United States in 2004, they were arrested, right? So, I mean, it's a very complicated thing in terms of what we're willing to accept and what we're willing to attend to. And thinking that Facebook is going to become a viable place for substantive politics, I think it's great for Facebook because they get more of our content. It's not great for our political lives.
I just really want to underline that because I think this is such a critical point. I mean, to your question of identity and anonymity, for instance, I think social media is clearly Janus-faced. And it, on the one hand, offers opportunity for expression, but it also offers opportunity for oversharing. What I'm worried about is 2 points. One is the one that was just raised. First is that people don't know what they're sharing or not, or who they're sharing to. So that is, I think, a real concern. Oversharing is fine when people know that what they're sharing and to whom. But what I'm right now quite concerned about is that the general actor in these social media spaces don't often know. And then secondarily is this Zuckermanization of our civic engagement and dialogue in the case of those kinds of discourses, which is not a public versus private space, but it is a corporatization of those spaces where ownership of that content is strictly controlled. So for instance, in the kind of work we're doing around social media and civic engagement in Nigeria, we are going to public spaces in Facebook and violating the Facebook terms of use to actually make public use of those so-called public spaces. Because of point of fact, they're not public spaces, they're corporatized spaces owned by Facebook.
That's great. I have a few more questions that I prepared, but we're about halfway through the panel. I want to make sure we get some good time for questions from the audience. So let's open it up. We have microphones down here. If folks have questions for our panelists, please just come on up to the front. Beth can always be counted on.
I always have one question. So this is, and I hate to derail you because you guys are starting to really get into this topic, but one of the areas that I've always found that interesting in this is the relationship of using, whether it's social media or civic media, in the face of a community expressing their true identity or true status compared to what is being projected about them from another source. And I wonder if you have some examples of that. In the humanitarian response, you just see examples of this in terms of disaster response. So, the federal agencies are coming down and saying, this is where the trouble is, and the folks on the ground are saying, no, that's actually Joe's barn that's on fire, and that's over there. It's not over here. And basically this discourse of, you guys don't know what you're talking about. This is what it is on the ground. But I think that also conveys into the identity of a community. So when a community can say, no, this is how we're being portrayed in the media, this is how we're being portrayed by folks on the outside, and we're going to actually engage with media in a way to tell our story back. So can folks talk about that dialogue and that pushback? Yes, no? Examples, yes, no? Crazy?
Well, I feel like I'm talking too much, but an example I would say is sort of the positive component of people manipulating their external public face. And that I particularly think is what's happened when we look at this hashtag revolutions, color revolutions, Twitter revolutions, in particular in, say, Iran. So the media treatment of the Twitter revolution in Iran was primarily, if not exclusively, focused on English language tweets. The Iranians were not organizing or militantizing in English language tweets. They were, using Farsi. What was the purpose of English language tweets, and where were they coming from? Well, they were either occasionally coming from it within Iran, and their purpose was to bring public international attention, in other words, to manage their external face, or they were more often actually coming from outside of Iran, but for those same purposes with stakeholders in the diaspora or other stakeholders. So I think I'm saying that there is this positive role for these technologies in communities that don't traditionally have direct access to manage sort of outreach programs. But the flip side, or the danger, is that the traditional media misreads it, as is the case of the Twitter revolution. So rather than saying, oh, this is a phenomena where these folks are advocating for international attention via social media, and so it's sort of the Twitter publicity and communication program as opposed to the Twitter revolution, it gets read as, oh, these folks are organizing, it's a Twitter revolution.
I have a totally different example that probably has more of a local and less of a truly heavy global counterweight. But I view this maybe not as a dialogue, but as just a great opportunity for for there to be more local information into a process. And I think back to, you guys may have remembered maybe about 4 months ago, there was a fair amount of press around an area of Atlanta called Peoplestown, where Mayor Reed had gone down to speak to them, there was a groundswell out of the community with concerns about stormwater and sewage in their communities. This is close to Turner Field. And what didn't get covered in that was actually Mayor Reed was quite surprised. He was planning on going down to talk to them about youth development and what he was doing with recreation centers. This was not anywhere on his radar screen up until about half an hour before he was supposed to speak with them. And so the administration kind of went through this crazy period of trying to say, well, you know, Chief Services Officer Amy Fong, who was on her way down, turn around, don't even bother coming. We're getting the Commissioner of Watershed as fast as we can down here. We're now going to go look at people's homes instead. Now, we had the data internally, you could argue, for us to be aware of the fact that this is what Peoplestown cared about, not youth development. I'm sure they do care about youth development somewhere, but this was their burning issue. But the reality is the way the city was set up currently today, we weren't in a situation whatsoever to mine that, to be aware of that, to have our fingers on the pulse of what are the biggest concerns of local areas so we can best prioritize our resources and mobilize against those things. And I use that example because that's one of my favorite ones that I'm hoping we can actually solve against as we, in a year from now, roll out our 311, because we actually will have all of our service delivery data in one place. And it will be queryable by a geographic code so that whenever the mayor is going to speak somewhere, we could probably do some advanced queries against that and make sure that we're in a good, positive situation going into that. And if not, then to have a true, open, prepared dialogue around that instead. So that might be another angle where I view this much more as an opportunity in terms of the data that's out there and how we can use that to be just better serve constituents.
Other questions? Come on up.
So this is social networking. I'm a networking guy. So if I start at the bottom and think about networking, one of the things in networking is feedback. And I'm curious if you think the data mining in Facebook and Twitter and people with these things like reputation management and these kinds of things are creating feedback loops in these media that we have that are positive reinforcing, negative reinforcing, or in some way quickly changing the flow of the data in ways that we hadn't expected. Does that make sense? The question, at least.
You know, I haven't seen any example of that at the local level because it's a blip, right? It's actually not. I don't think there's enough data there. So I'll just say I haven't seen that through social media at the local level.
I don't know. I personally feel like there's negative reinforcement in a sense, because the problem with social networks, social media in general, is that influence trumps veracity in many ways. Mm-hmm. So you find someone has a lot of influence, but you might not be telling the truth all the time. But this great echo chamber is the best tool there is out there to disperse this rumor. And I mean, we've seen that quite a bit of rumor, right? But that's only because there are some major influences out there. Mm-hmm. So, go ahead.
Are you done?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to offer a counterpoint, and I'm normally the curmudgeon in the room, but a bit of optimism, which is, I think the good thing about social media, and when it's good, that means we have scale and scope, is that social media can be self-correcting when you have enough of a population that's broad and diverse enough. So David and I do a lot of social media election monitoring stuff. And I did Liberia's election in November of last year. And there were folks who had all sorts of voice and zero veracity. And they were basically calling election fraud on the behalf of who ended up becoming a second-term president, which is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And there was a lot of volume from this group. And what happened is the community quickly combated these inaccurate comments, were able to marshal sort of a voice in response in real time. The monitor for the particular, this is a Facebook group, actually then deleted her membership into the group. And then what I found the most fascinating is the community then had a very deep and important conversation about whether or not it was appropriate to have shut down her voice in the conversation. In other words, to have censored her, to prior restrain her voice, even though they knew it was completely BS, or whether they should have allowed her to sort of have, spew these lies and then return afterwards. So I thought not only did social media in this case self-correct, but then they took an action and then had a really deep, important conversation about sort of, well, when is it a right for us to perform prior restraint on an interlocutor versus trying to quash the lies after the fact?
So I agree with that. What I was saying is not that social media doesn't self-correct, but that in local politics and issues, it does it on such a small scale that you're not going to see a system-wide reflection of that popping up through some sort of data mining of Facebook or I think it works very effectively, actually, in issues in Atlanta and issues in my neighborhood, maybe even issues in my region. But those are small in thinking about the overall data. It's not like you're going to affect what's trending on Facebook or Twitter, I think, with these things.
Yeah, I think one of the...
and that's exciting.
Yes, I'd reinforce, as I think, when you have it kind of broader or more open and transparency would be the key, that's when it can work as a self-correcting engine. Where my mind, for some reason, went to when you asked your question was Mayor Cory Booker. The best way to get a pothole filled in Newark, New Jersey is to tweet Mayor Booker. I will tell you this, his entire staff hates his Twitter account. Hates his Twitter account. And there's a very good rationale for this. Because what's happening is the people who are tweeting Mayor Booker is now taking incomplete sets of information about these potholes. Where are they? How big of an issue? Is it even on a city road? Is it a state road? Where is it? Right? He's taking this incomplete information, he's tossing it into their system, and he is knocking out all of the requests and reprioritizing resources against them. And so, it's funny, but if you think about transparency, access, fairness, all those things that really, are supposed to be predicated upon a city, he's totally violating all of that at the end of the day. The fact of the matter is people who don't know his Twitter handle or who might not, Carl and I have had a brief discussion about this before, the digital divide. I do believe it exists, particularly generational, as we deal with a lot of the elderly population here in Atlanta who aren't tied in. If they don't have, the Twitter handle, quite frankly, their requests are falling lower in the queue. And so that is, maybe a more radical example of where some of this idea of kind of having it, unfortunately, in a locus of kind of one kind of power figure where there isn't a lot of transparency of how those things get operationalized afterwards, and he's caught up in being the hero, right? And so obviously then he gets more publicity about it, and then more people are submitting their potholes, and his administration's going crazy. At some point, somebody's going to write a great article about the fact that, this is actually not a fair practice for those individuals. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just to add on to this, on an average day, I'm sure most of you know about the 1-9-90 rule. 1% of the people are creating, 9% are consuming, right, watching, and the other 90 are just there, right? And the two, at least from my experience, the two things that really change that equation usually occur either during a disaster or, there are two things, disaster and politics. And with regards to, what people are saying and how long it takes to self-correct, for instance, right? Disaster probably brings out the best in us, right? Politics is something else. Half of the U.S. is about to secede, apparently, right? So, so I think it's like it's a moving average. Well, while initially I said it is, can be negatively reinforcing, I think it really depends on the context. I think that's really important as well. So.
Any questions? Come on up. We want to make sure we capture these at the mic because I think there's a web feed going out. Yeah.
Great. Ben Stokes, USC. I was just curious about playfulness. And I asked this because the two examples that were mentioned, election and disaster, it's kind of like what control do we have of those? They're kind of scheduled, or we kind of hope they don't happen. And yet, if we look for where are people engaging with social media, mass popular media is out there. How many people vote in American Idol as part of an entertainment franchise? And I think that a lot of, take the title civic computing, which brings to mind a rational approach. We want to get away from the mall that was mentioned into a kind of more deliberative forum. And yet, if 80 people are the most to go to often these city forums, how much can we do to restructure them as places of rational, deliberate, dutiful thought? And the other, I just wonder whether, is there an alternative, and is it really an opposed alternative to say, let's focus on engagement? Is there a way to make it playful and have that be a protected space where we still have deliberation? I'm not calling for games as a way of running our political system. Is a game enough already? But I'm just kind of curious about what people think about playfulness as a way of engaging people.
That's a great question.
So I think that you do need, I think you definitely do not need deliberative, rational systems. I think that's exactly, we don't need more of those. Like what you need is systems that are irrational, right? That allow me to stand up and tell you why it's really important for me to have a stop sign on my street and not have to back that up with a ream of observational data, or I've had one of those tracking systems. So my criticism about the mall wasn't that because the mall was playful, it's because the mall was overly commoditized. So I think you do need these spaces that allow us to play out in a kind of contest, right? This is want to go back really far, this is what democracy is about. It's a kind of contest that allows us to have these different perspectives and act out different value sets in a way that lets us understand what the implications are and make more informed decisions. I think that's one of the most important challenges for the design of civic engagement today, is to think about what are those spaces, how do they get created, how do we get people to participate in them. I definitely think that play is a part of it. I think the problem with play, my hesitation is, like, I don't need a badge for civic engagement. And unfortunately, that's where that discourse is right now, is that we need to gamify it, we need to give you a badge, we need to make it an achievement unlocked, right? I voted. I think if you want to do that, that's fine. Then you've gone from like the mall to the theme park. So it's a little different, but not really.
You can be the mayor.
Be the mayor, right? Yeah, can I be the mayor?
You design the space.
All right, there we go.
My only concern with gamifying things is that in a digital space, there's already a significant amount of abstraction between the person and what it is that they're making a decision to or on or contributing to, right? So I think I feel like if you gamify it, and already this system is already easy enough to engage with, I feel like when it's really important, people will tend to look at things in a similar way. This is much like a game. And I hate to keep going back to disaster and crisis response, but that's where I'm coming from, is people are looking at a dot on a map, and because of how abstracted they are from that situation, they might not realize that behind that dot is an experience of life in one way or another that impacts a human being somewhere. So I don't know.
Yes, that's all right. I was just saying my one very short last comment on this would be, I'm not sure if playfulness is the right word, but experience will be what would matter, right? And I don't know that we understand well enough yet across kind of all the diversity that we have in our population in Atlanta, what are the kind of intrinsic motivators for individual to engage and participate. But you would want to design an experience that speaks to those specific motivators, and that would be a great thing for Georgia Tech to help us understand and develop. Sorry.
Well, actually, I'm glad. I'm Janine Robinson. I do cause branding and social innovation, and it's funny that this subject is actually coming up. What is your idea on this whole idea of slacktivism? And, a lot of when we're talking about people reporting potholes, a lot of it's one-sided, it's more, let me bring up an issue, but your experience in being able to take it from a Facebook like to actual action and actual engagement, as opposed to kind of a one-sided, hey, this is wrong, or hey, this is going on, but actually being able to be engaged and motivated.
I don't want to nominate, but I'm happy to take a first foray into that. I think that, and this is where I was talking about kind of how we make the online and offline world work together. I do believe that kind of the spark can be created online, and there could be a lot of galvanizing that can happen online. And I think, for example, I was just talking to someone this morning about this new proposed development that they're looking at, I guess, in the Glenwood area. There's a very large response starting to galvanize out of the community on it. And my understanding is that some of the zoning laws aren't in the favor of the community, they're in the favor of the developer at the moment. But I was commenting to someone that, first of all, our Department of Community Planning hasn't made any decisions on it yet. And number two, they've already kind of gotten the attention because of this spark, this galvanizing that's starting to occur of our city council members. And so it'll be fascinating to watch how this interplay plays out. But already, just the sheer fact that there's already some critical mass starting to form around. When we have critical mass form around something in this city, our politicians respond and they start engaging. And I like to say, generally we get the right kinds of outcomes for our constituents out of that. And there's going to be a wonderful conversation that comes out of this that's going to be around economic development and jobs versus what this particular community wants in their neighborhood. And I think that's going to be a fantastic thing. There's going to be a very powerful city council meeting coming up, I predict it. And that is exactly how this process is supposed to work. What I worry about is the things that for some reason, and the communities where those sparks should be happening and maybe aren't happening, or happening in small pockets and just underneath the kind of eye view of our council members, for example, enough that we're not getting that kind of energy yet. And what are the ways we can kind of use technology to kind of galvanize and get that process going a little bit better for some of those less well-served communities? I hand that off.
So this has been great. I think you've been dancing around something, and I want to see if you can be a little more specific. And that is, what are the attributes? What are the requirements? Maybe the changes required for organizations to really use these technologies, right? And I think you've talked about disasters. You've talked about the disadvantaged and different communities. So I'm curious, what do we need to be focused on to be successful, because it seems like otherwise we're just building technology for technology's sake?
That's $1 million question, isn't it?
Young people, get rid of all the old people. and of course I mean young at heart, not chronologically young or old.
I think part of the problem, and I see this all the time, is when you look at nonprofits or even regular corporations, when they look at like social media, to them this is a marketing tool for driving the same one-way conversation or one-way, bestowing upon the masses, this thing they're trying to sell, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, right? So I think the issue is, and I think the same goes with government. It's more for marketing than conversation. But I think, unfortunately, the masses are, initially, you could get them that way, but I think people are more aware now. They know when you're trying to sell them. They know when you're not trying to talk to them. They know that, they're not talking to me. They're trying to sell me something, but they don't want to hear my opinion. So I don't think that's the answer, but that's my observation. That's
I think it's human resources at the end of the day. It's not. I really just don't think that it's a technology problem. I think that it's a problem of there's design issues that need to be taken into account, and there's human resource issues. There was a show. There was a thing on NPR this morning about gas wells in Pennsylvania. And they know where these gas wells are, and even if they continue mapping the rest of them, they actually don't have the resources to plug them. So you can make me some awesome mobile tool, and I can run around, and I can tag all these gas wells, and it'll be geolocated, and it can go into a database and can be tracked. And at the end of the day, the state doesn't have the funds to hire the people to go out and address this problem. And so for me, the issues are it's the biggest issue, right? It's like, how do you realign our resources in our society towards human resources to get the work done that needs to get done?
Sorry. I was going to say, just to add on to that, I think initially, even we ourselves overemphasized the importance of technology. And now we build software, but we like to call it the 10% of the solution, because most of the work actually goes into outreach, to branding and whatnot. Real crowdsourcing takes a lot of work. So yes, it's a very human resource type problem and not a technology problem.
I'd like to sort of underline that, and in some ways it's the dirty little secret that found some elements of kind of going back to the impact of all of the opportunities that we've been discussing. So taking, for example, the road quality, whether it's potholes or other road quality issues, I've also worked on phone apps that allow you to map issues around road quality. Ultimately, the decision makers know where the problems are on the roads. And it's a bit of fiction to think that providing them simply details as to road quality issues is going to solve the problem. The problem is one not of just human resources, but of resources full stop, political will, accountability, all these broader issues that we've sort of talked about. And so, unfortunately, we think that, we as technologists at heart, many of us hope that these systems, it's just a small matter of better information, more quickly and diligently delivered. But in point of fact, in many of these cases, lack of information is not the problem, but it's lack of these broader issues of resources and will, power, or political will that are underlying the problems.
Yeah, I mean, just to throw on one of the things that your comments sparked and you all supported is, I worked in the corporate world for 15 years before I joined the city of Atlanta, and I always used to say it's rarely the technology that is the problem, it's the people and the processes that are the problems. And we used to have this great debate with the management team I worked with about whether or not we really should be carving off some of the bigger areas that we saw as customer problems, and instead of kind of doing a quick fix, and I think about your semester timeframes that you guys work under, to quickly drive solutions for them. Well, you want to do some of that in a prototyping type of mode. The reality is that we usually didn't crack the answer until we had spent a very long period of time with those customers, buried in those problems, trying multiple ways to attack them before we got to a point where we had something that was viable and revenue generating. And so, this stuff is hard for a reason, and unfortunately, like I said, it's really the technology. Now, I will say this, that I carried that motto right up until I walked into the doors of City Hall, and now I actually think sometimes it is the technology too. But to reflect on that, that is also a function of priorities. I mean, right now the infrastructure for City Hall has been a result of years and years and years of duct tape on top of duct tape top of duct tape. I mean, I worry about things like our disaster recovery situation. I worry about our data centers and the aging of technology. I worry about the fact we have some things that where we have developers go in and work on production-ready systems sometimes during the day. And I just cross my fingers. And by the way, I don't have any of the Department of Technology reporting to me, but our CIO would tell you that these things are just pandemic. But you know what? They're not cool. They're not cool problems where we could get a lot of great, energetic Georgia Tech students or other individuals interested in. They're a matter of disciplined leadership, strategic planning, and actual execution against those things. Those are what we really, really need, though, right now in the city of Atlanta before we need our next app.
Time for just one more very quick question.
Thanks. This is Mark Lubau. My question is around government surveillance. We've talked a lot about trying to facilitate civic discourse. How do you think that's going to be impacted with the proliferation of all of the video cameras and everything that's watching us? Do you think there's going to be a trust issue with people, citizens sharing their opinions and views and actually wanting to interact with the government?
Of course, there already is, right? I mean, whenever the AJC did an article about the cameras that have been set up by the Atlanta Police Department, and that already brought on a whole wave of response and you want to enjoy. I often go and look at the comments on articles in AJC, and you'd be amazed by what people see fit to publish in those, and maybe protected by anonymity. But yeah, absolutely, it's going to bring on a strong amount of discourse, which I think is a wonderful thing for us to do in the Bounce community.
I would say what's interesting is it's not, right, that's not new. So we've had that for a long time now. On a positive note, I would say that one of the things, there are more ways to surveil our actions and discourses now than before. There's also more ways to bring that to light and to actually have a public discussion about it. So, there's a project that I remember being launched it got a lot of flack, and it was launched a month after September 11th, that provided a map of all the surveillance cameras in New York City, in which you could pick your starting route and your ending route, and it would give you the route of least surveillance that you could walk through the city with. That's a pretty powerful thing to put out there and tell people that those cameras aren't going to go away, but at the same time, if you want to produce a tool, like if you want to produce a tool that's going to allow someone to decide whether or not they want to circumvent that, you can also do that. I think that's a really powerful opportunity for individual civic action, and also to open up dialogue between different constituents in this. Right? The surveillance issue is really tricky, but I think that we have opportunities to have new kinds of dialogue because those tools are now in citizens' hands and and other hands, and there's opportunities there that didn't exist before.
This has been a great discussion. Unfortunately, I believe we are out of time at this point, so we're going to have to wrap it up. I just want to thank our panelists again.